All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I think this will be a really fun program. I'm excited about it. So just a little introduction. So Terri Meeks started in genealogy in 2000, and she has been volunteering for the museum since 2018. And we're very excited to have her presenting this program today. As always, I will have the chat function up. So if you have any questions, feel free to send them through the chat, and I will be monitoring that throughout the program. And we'll also have a little bit of time at the end if you have any last minute questions before we end the program. And this program will be recorded, and we will be putting it up on YouTube at a later date after we get that all set up. So if you want to see it again or share it with someone, we will be placing it on YouTube. And as well as if you're having any issues, can't figure out the chat or something, feel free to also email me. It is mkeaton, so mkeaton @canyoncity.org. I will also have my email up monitoring that, so you can also send me questions there. But the chat will be probably the easiest way to do that. It's just down at the bottom of your screen, and you should see a notification from me. Feel free as well, if you'd like, to send a quick message hi to me to make sure that I know your chat is working. And without further ado, I think we will get started.
Good morning. Well, I'm really glad that at least the weather outside is not quite frightful, a little bit cold, but at least not frightful. So hopefully you are in a comfortable place with a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and we'll just jump right in. When we do some of our genealogy resources, we look to the traditional ones, the census records, the vital records, and we don't dig all that deeply. We get really excited when we find a family group together in a census record, and we may record their names and we may record their approximate birth dates until we actually get a birth or a marriage certificate. But what really tells the story about our family is digging deeper. Our families lived lives. They might have just been farmers, but there were things that went on around them that might have influenced their lives, influenced their moving habits, or brought about some form of tragedy. And we need to delve into those a little bit more. So today we're going to take a look at what maybe the weather had to do with some of our ancestors and what the consequences were. You probably recognize a photo very similar to this from the Dust Bowl. The era was also called the Dirty 30s. And for the most part, we hear about Oklahoma, but know that also parts of Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, as well as Kansas were also affected by the drought and storms that blew up. Some of these dust storms were so severe, they were called black blizzards, and the debris reached as far as the East Coast. In our lifetimes, we can think about the eruption of Mount St. Helens and see how the winds carried debris and ash across the nation. So we're going to look at some of these weather phenomenon. As a result of the Dust Bowl and the stock market crash in 1929, President Roosevelt started two main programs: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, or the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. Camp Roosevelt was the first of the camps for the CCC, and it was actually set up in Virginia in 1933. So you're doing some family research, and you start and look at the 1940 census, and you might find an occupation over on the far right, and you might also see that some of your family were working at a CCC camp. It will give the occupation. This young man had a 4-year college degree and from the census, and we see that he's a teacher at the CCC camp. So I wonder what he was teaching. Was he teaching agricultural methods? Was he teaching forestry methods? These censuses happen to be drawn from Colorado. And we notice that people are moving as a result. They have moved from Kansas or Missouri, Tennessee, Texas, and they're moving westward to escape the weather conditions. So, is someone in your family affected in this similar way? The Civilian Conservation Corps was originally called the Emergency Conservation Works, and it started in April of 1933. And in Colorado, eventually 47 CCC camps were established. They were established throughout the nation as well as Colorado and other areas to combat some of the poverty and joblessness that was crossing the country during the 30s after the Depression or during the Depression. In Colorado, they built roads, campgrounds. They did some fire suppression services, which is something that we could certainly use today. And there were, over the decades, there were many bad agricultural habits that led to soil and water erosion and just uprooting all of the native grasses across much of the Midwest. One of the interesting things in this particular area was that the CCC completed construction of the Red Rocks Amphitheater. And we have a picture from the Denver Public Library showing some of the work that has been done and underway. It was interesting for me, not being a native of Colorado, to see that the Colorado State Archives has an extensive collection of these CCC records. So if you happen to be a native Coloradan, there is a website that you can go to, and it will have just an index of the CCC records that are available for the state of Colorado. And here is listed the kinds of information that might be found on those records. Unfortunately, if you want to actually get a copy of the records, you will have to write for them and pay a fee. Hopefully, when the archives are open again, you could actually visit and see the records. I assume also that other states have maintained some of their CCC records as well. Having moved westward in the 1930s, we look also at construction workers. In Washington state, we notice that the Grand Coulee Dam has been under construction, and we see that many of the people are working in dam construction. We also see Clark County, Nevada, and we see a particular family I've chopped off, unfortunately, but Mr. Mathis was working on the Hoover Dam. And in doing a little bit more digging, we find a picture of some folks that were working on the dam, along with names that are recorded across the bottom. And this is Mr. Mathis. He's identified in the picture. So by digging a little further, and this was simply with a Google search, I was able to find something for Mr. Mathis. So if he or any of these members of your family might have worked on some of the dam construction, you too might be able to find a picture. Here are his co-workers. They add to the story. What was his actual job when constructing the dam? It allows you to create an entire narrative for his life. Oops. We're going to move on to tornadoes. I chose this one because it is one of the largest tornadoes, and it's really a unique situation. The Natchez, Tennessee tornado actually occurred in 1840, and at the time it was the second deadliest tornado in history, U.S. history. 317 people were killed and many were injured. It is interesting to note that outlying areas that might have been in neighboring states like Louisiana, the people that might have been killed or injured were not counted there. And this is 1840, so slave deaths were not counted at this particular time. One of the interesting things about the tornado is it followed the river. It stripped the forest and it struck the Natchez Landing, which was a port at the time. And the reason it was so deadly on the river was it picked up the flatboats and actually tossed them in the air and either threw them on land or landed them back in the river. So that's one reason for the high death count. The destruction in the area was virtually complete at that time, especially 1840. Most of the structures were probably wooden at the time. And we see here a simple tombstone in Natchez of Mr. John Sawnby Smith. And if you can read under slightly underneath, I realize it's probably very difficult, but it actually states on the tombstone that he was felled by the great tornado in Natchez in May of 1840. So a local resident was actually killed that day. And you now have a greater story that you might be able to tell about him. But we're going to Ancestry, and we have found one of our ancestors, Alonzo Cicero Sexton, and he's born in 1816 in Windsor, Connecticut, and he dies in May of 1840. But there's no place for his death. He's only 24 years old. So was it some disease? What were the causes of his death? We're going to dig a little further. We find a Connecticut Deaths and Burial Index, and it shows that he was born about 1816 and that he died on the 14th of May in 1840 in New Haven, Connecticut. Are we sure that's right? Under normal circumstances, we would not have any reason to look any further. However, in looking at some newspapers, we find that Alonzo, in a June 12th edition of the Christian Secretary, is in Natchez, and he's from Simsbury, Connecticut, and he died on May 14th at the age of 24. What also piqued my interest on this is Mr. Pease, who died in Valparaiso, South America. There's a story there as well. In doing more newspaper research, we find that at Natchez, Alonzo C. Sexton of Simsbury has died, and in the fall of 1837, he has given himself to Christ. And supposedly from his dying lips, he said, "I'm happy and going to heaven." I want to know who actually recorded that dying oath. So in doing some in-depth newspaper research, we find that Alonzo actually died in Natchez. What we don't know, because it's the 1840 census that he last appears in, we don't know what his occupation was. He probably was a farmer, but he was from Simsbury, Connecticut. What took him from Connecticut to Natchez, Mississippi? on that fateful day. What caused him to go there for that trip? Was he selling something? Was he just on a pleasure trip on the Mississippi River? We don't know, and that will take further digging. But we do know the story and circumstances of his death. And there are many, many accounts written about the Natchez tornado that could add depth to your genealogy story. We also see Sterling Goddard in a 1930 census. You note that in the censuses before 1850, 1840, and back to 1790, we just have tabular data representing the families. So we don't know what his occupation was or much of any further information just by looking at the census. But there are books available, out of print books, available at archive.nos.org. And you can find local histories that might give you some valuable information about your ancestor. In this case, Mr. Goddard and his wife were Congregationalists, and they started a society, and they were officers, they were deacons in the society. They never erected an actual house of worship, which is interesting in and of itself. But in looking at Find a Grave, we find Mr. Goddard's tombstone. He's buried on June 3rd of 1840, and he's only supposedly about 32 years old. And this tombstone is in Lorain, Ohio. But if you will note, this is a cenotaph, and that means that the person, this is just a memorial stone. The person is actually buried someplace else. And fortunately, on this record, it identifies Natchez, Mississippi, where he is actually buried. So we know that he might not have succumbed the actual day of the tornado, but perhaps as a result of the injuries. Here again, we don't know what his occupation was. What takes him from Lorain, Ohio, which is on the Great Lakes, down to Natchez, Mississippi? So perhaps there is more information available in one of those county histories, newspapers, or other documents that might help add to your family story. There is several websites allow you to ask questions. And we see a question that was asked by a reader at some point, why Mr. Goddard is buried there. And as a result of doing some research into weather and weather phenomenon, we find out and we now know that he died as a result of the tornado. Uh-oh. What does a volcano in Indonesia have to do with your ancestors half a world away? Well, back in the year 1816, the United States was undergoing a little ice age. Actually, the whole world at that time had been experiencing below average temperatures. From 1812 to 1814, there were a series of volcanic eruptions, and finally, the Indonesian volcano Mount Tambora erupted in 1815. What does that have to do with us? It affected many, many areas of the United States, Canada, and as far as Western Europe. I found it interesting that the days were dark, the sun was blocked so that it was perpetual night. There was a lot of cloud cover. In some areas there were droughts, but in other areas there was heavy moisture, unusual flooding. Frost killed the crops in New England, which caused great uh, economic woes. Snow in June in Albany, New York, frozen rivers, ice in Pennsylvania in the summer, and frost even in August as far south as Virginia. So this was a significant event. As I mentioned, it was an agricultural disaster. Crops failed because they didn't have a long enough growing season and there wasn't enough light for them. Grain prices, grain, a staple for flour and other things in people's diets, those prices escalated. And this is 1816, so we know that the transportation system was totally inadequate at the time. So people might have decided to move west from the New England states, which were heavily affected, to the Midwest or the West to find better circumstances. Here again, newspaper reports give us a lot of information about what the weather conditions were and their effect upon the people in the local communities. And if you look at the 1850 census, this is a particular example for Abbott family members. And you'll notice that all of these people, some quite young, but all of these people were alive during that 1816 event. They were all born in Vermont, but they are now in Ohio. So they have moved westward, potentially to avoid some of the crop failures that they had experienced earlier in the decades in Vermont. We don't know this for 100% sure, but looking into county histories and searching for the Abbott families, we can potentially find more information about them. And here, for example, is Mr. Erastus Abbott, who was on the previous page, and he's in Licking County, Ohio, having moved there from Vermont. And Abbott, Mr. Abbott. And we see that he has brought some of his family members with him. We also see, and this is also from Ohio, Licking County, and Erastus is marrying Polly Bills. And this is as early as 1819. So immediately after the 1816 year and the failure of the crops, Erastus has picked up his stuff and he has moved westward in search of a better life. Ohio had been opened in the year 1805 for colonization and settlement. So Erastus might have been among the first residents in Licking County. And we have the ever-persistent snow, but in much greater quantities. In 1888, we had the Great White Hurricane. Actually, there were several storms that were named the Great White Hurricane over the years. This particular one affected New England, New York, New Jersey, and further south, almost to Maryland. There were between almost 2 and 5 feet of snow and 50-foot drifts and severe winds that got up to hurricane speed. It paralyzed the East Coast. Here again, we're looking early on, and transportation systems were not that great. We might have had to rely on ships, and unfortunately, many of them were grounded or wrecked in this storm. Transportation above ground became gridlocked, fire stations. One of the consequences of many weather events is fires. And in this case, fire stations were immobilized. They couldn't get through the high snow drifts to put out fires. After the event, as the snow melted, it resulted in severe flooding. So more than 400 people died in this particular weather event. And we see it reported in ever-glowing terms in the newspapers of the time, how the tempest howled and raged through the dark wilderness of streets. So very dramatic. Believe it or not, this is not India. This is Wall Street in New York City, probably in about 1900, late 1890s, 1900. As a result of that great white hurricane, the telephone and telegraph services in New York City, as well as Boston and other major cities, were moved from above ground to below ground. Subways were constructed rather than having the streetcar lines. Boston got their first subway system in 1897. New York followed in 1904. And of course, at the time, weather prediction was not as good as it is today. And these are acts of Mother Nature. So even with today's predictions, sometimes they're not fully accurate. But weather balloons were used at the time to forecast the weather. When the subway was built in New York City, the first one was the Interborough Rapid Transit, the IRT, and it had been advertised as one of its selling points was that it was to relieve some of the congestion above ground on the streetcars. But what they found was that it was so popular that that congestion just moved from the streets down into the subway system. The first system was not widely popular, 3 hours to Harlem. So it took a long time, and apparently it seemed to be a rattle trap. Things obviously got better because the subway system is currently still working. Here again, we're on Ancestry, and we're looking at a family tree, and we see a Frederick Slater. He's born in Washington, D.C., and he died in Yonkers, New York. And you can look at each of the census years, and in those census years, you find out that he was an engineer. But what kind of engineer? As it turns out, here is his passport application, and he's going from Texas to the Republic of Mexico. He's going to Mexico City in Saltillo, and it turns out that he is working for a company, an engineering company in Texas. And I actually looked up the engineering company, and the initials still exist today. However, I don't know whether the company is the same as the one that he actually worked for. But he's an engineer. And here again, our good old-fashioned Google and out-of-print books, we find Frederick Slater. He's the assistant engineer in charge of third rail construction. Can you imagine that? This is your ancestor, and in 1904, he's working to put the subway system in New York City. A note You're going to have to look at some unusual websites. Who knew that there was an entire organization, an entire website dedicated to the history of the New York City subway? And it contains all kinds of historical documents, maps, descriptions of the various jobs, and it has name lists of the directors, engineering staff, and workers. So you just have to, I don't want to use the phrase think outside the box, what I just did, but you do have to think of ways that you could dig deeper to find more information about your family, where they were at a particular time, and what was going on in that location during the time period that your ancestors were alive. There were, as I mentioned, other notable blizzards, most of them throughout the Midwest, but also along the Great Lakes. The one in 1913, many ships sank in the Great Lakes. It was another one of those fluke weather patterns. But if you had someone that was a captain or served as a sailor in the Great Lakes, you might find some information there. If you happen to be descended from Minnie Freeman Penny, in 1888, she rescued 13 children. She was teaching school in a sod house in Ord, Nebraska. And after the roof was blown off, Minnie tied the hands of her 13 pupils together and led them through the blinding storm to safety. Her heroism was reported far and wide in newspapers of the day, and there was even a song written about her. Wouldn't you love to get a copy of that sheet music if indeed you were a descendant? The Johnstown flood. This occurred in 1889 as the result of a storm. A dam broke. It had rained for several days and the water just built up. It was an earthen dam and it gave way, and 20 million tons of water cascaded down in just 40 minutes. So many, a couple of thousand people were killed in that flood. Were your people in Pennsylvania at the time? We have newspaper accounts. Railroads and bridges were swept away. Many homes, the houses in the area were swept away. And as I mentioned earlier, fire added to the horrors of the flood. There is an entire website for Columbia County, Pennsylvania that is dedicated to the Johnstown flood. This happens to be just a simple listing of the flood victims, where they had their residence, their age, and where they are buried. And at the same time, Find a Grave also has a listing, a separate listing of the Johnstown flood victims. So if your people were in that particular area, you might search out and see, are they buried in Cambria County? And it might be as a result of the flood. One of the interesting things in coming across newspaper articles is that Clara Barton and the Red Cross were Johnny on the spot. Clara was 67 years old at the time, but she arrived with Red Cross workers to lend aid in Johnstown. They had doctors and nurses, and one of the things that they did was they provided feeding stations, but they also constructed hotels and some housing, 3,000 single-family homes for the flood victims to overcome the homelessness and the ravages in the city. I would think that cleanup also would have been a monumental task at that time. We see our relative William Williams, and he's a shiprigger in the 1880 Philadelphia census. But in looking through newspapers, we find that Clara Barton came, but we also have the ambulance driver is Mr. William Williams, who has done more for Johnstown than any two men in it. Mr. Williams was in Philadelphia when the flood occurred. He is a rigger by trade, but left his occupation at once, started for Johnstown. He was a shiprigger, but he rendered aid when it was most needed. A wonderful hero story to add to your family history. And we have hurricanes. We're going to take a look today at the Galveston hurricane that occurred in 1900. It is one of the deadliest U.S. weather events. Killed approximately 8,000 people. The whole of Galveston Island was inundated, and we'll take a further look there. There are others, Okeechobee, which is in Florida in 1928, there were 2,500 casualties. And when the hurricane season of 1893 was over, there were over 1,000 deaths. So hurricanes have been very deadly through the centuries. And you need to look into when and where your people died and what were the conditions at the time. All of these records, many of these records predate death certificates. So it takes some additional digging into perhaps obituaries or town and local histories to find out what was happening at the time that your person might have passed. Here again, we find some of the victims. They are in Galveston, buried in various cemeteries, but they all died on September 8th of 1900. What were the consequences of this particular hurricane? Troops were sent to occupy Galveston Island. The businessmen, obviously, many of the businesses were destroyed. Newspapers had to stop, transportation, and it's an island, so transportation to and from the island was greatly disrupted. Bridges were actually destroyed, so people were isolated on the island. And just like with New York City earlier, the streetcars and light plants were out of commission at the time. So that influenced business, influenced the recovery efforts, et cetera. So it takes a long time to recover from one of these events. So the industries are making a start. They're trying to resume their business. Debris is being carted away. In this case, we're going to find out that 3 steamers are in the port of Galveston. And you ask, what does a tombstone of a man from Maine have to do with Galveston? We notice that his tombstone says, Captain Norman Mary. Well, what was he a captain of. Was he a military man? Nope. We find him in the 1900 census, and he's living in Maine, and he is a sailor. Here again, there are these obscure websites that have information, and I just simply entered Norman Mary, and it came up with a listing. Some of the listing predated. It starts all the way at 1892 and goes all the way up through 1900. And we have Captain Norman Mary, and he's the captain of a schooner named the Mary E. Lynch. One of the huge stores that was greatly impacted by this hurricane was the Mistro brothers. They sold dry goods, wholesale. They had a huge store, and they got together with other merchants to get rid of some of the damaged goods, as well as try to keep their business going, to sell some of those that were undamaged. And we see that later in the month, the flood was in September 8th. Later in the month, they're going to have a great flood sale. And ready-to-wear carpets and mattings, and having shipped in us by the schooners Mary E. Lynch, Hard Times and Matilda. Captain Mary was the captain of the schooner Mary E. Lynch. We know where he was on September 24th of 1900, aiding the victims and the economy of Galveston as a result of the flood. A wonderful story to add to your family history. I realize that many of our ancestors were either simple farmers or tradesmen, but always look at what was happening in their hometown, in their local neighborhood, and add that extra search for what was the weather doing at the time. Perhaps you might find a story of your own that deals with some traumatic event, whether they were victims, whether they were the heroes that responded, or whether they were able to simply carry on or were forced to move. Did they move to another location? In many cases, farmers moved because the land that they were working played out. But there might have been other circumstances as well that forced them to move, in most cases westward, but sometimes they might have returned to their original homesteads. I know in the Meeks family that some of the older brothers moved during the Depression and during the Dust Bowl from Oklahoma to Washington and to California to work on the dams. One relative actually just sold coffee at the dams. But at the end, they also moved back to their original roots in Oklahoma. So look at those migration patterns and see if perhaps they weren't affected in some way by weather conditions. What was their occupation? And were there other opportunities moving westward or into something else? The example of the snowstorm and building of the subway system. Your person might have been just a simple digger, but he might have worked on a really large project that had significance for the centuries to come. Could a weather event provide additional information or interest to their life story? And also think about your own story. What have been some of the weather events that have occurred during our lifetimes? I do remember the eruption of Mount St. Helens and the depositing of ash as far east as Oklahoma and Texas. I do remember fires in Mexico that have polluted the air and contributed to air quality alerts in the southern states. And some of these events may occur in one area, but are far reaching to other areas. So think about your own life, and when writing your own story, make sure to include a couple of these weather events. I want to thank you for coming this morning. Hopefully, we've given you some additional ideas that you can use to dig a little deeper and perhaps round out a family story. And we'll open it at this time for any questions that you might have.
Yeah, so if you do have any questions, just feel free to put it in that chat function, and we will just kind of keep it open for a little bit and see if anyone has any questions. And I'm thinking too, Terri, I think we could probably maybe send some of those links out to people. If you don't mind sending me those links, and I can email them to everybody. So if you are interested in the CCC ones or
I'll be happy to provide those.
Yeah. Well, we did have a question that how might COVID affect our story?
A very, very good question. It's not weather related, but it is a significant event that I don't think any of us are going to forget for the foreseeable future. And it is a question, a good question to ask. Number one, when thinking about writing your own story, how were you affected by COVID? Were members of your community, were members of your immediate family affected by COVID? Did someone pass away that you know as a result of COVID that might add to and complete their story? While it's a very, very sad event, yes, it is something to record and document in your own family history.
Well, and actually along with that, I do want to mention the museum does have, right now we do have a file on it because it is fall under our health. So we have a whole research section on health, and one of them is the COVID. And we actually do on our website have a section where if you are interested in sharing how COVID has affected you, you can actually go and type up about, I think we have it set for 750 words, and we're adding it to that file. And that's just so people in the future can come in and see how this event actually affected people in the local community. So if you're interested in sharing a little bit about your story and COVID, you can go to our website, museum.canyoncity.org, and scroll down, and there is a button that'll say, I believe it's sharing COVID or something like that, and you can share your story. So I just wanted to kind of mention that. We did have another question. Is there a good link for Dust Bowl information?
I don't know about a single link for Dust Bowl because it affected the different states, Oklahoma, Northern Texas, et cetera. And, but if you Google Dust Bowl, you will get hundreds of websites. You might want to narrow it down by the state. So Dust Bowl effect in Texas, Dust Bowl effect in Kansas, to research that way. And I'll be happy to look, and when we provide the list of links, I'll add a few about the Dust Bowl.
And if you're looking for specific Colorado, I do know History Colorado Center has done an exhibit on the Dust Bowl, so they might be a good resource to contact as well if you're specifically looking for Colorado. Other states, I doubt they would have much on, but I think that might also be a good place to contact to see, since they have an exhibit on it. And if you do think of questions later, Feel free to also email historycenter@canyoncity.org or again me at mkeaton@canyoncity.org. You can email either of those places, and if you just think of a question later, and I will forward it on to Terri and we'll try to get that answered. So if you think of something later, feel free to send us something then.
And we'll put in a plug here now. In February, on hopefully February 13th, that's another Saturday, we're going to do another program on love and marriage. We're going to look at the 9 different types of marriage records that might be available to you to find, hopefully, that woman's maiden name.
And we'll leave the chat up for just a little bit longer in case anyone has any more questions. We do appreciate, there's some people saying thank you for the program, and this has spurred them on to think of some other things. So we appreciate that. Hopefully, yeah, it's really helped you think of ways that you can do extra research on your family, things you may not have thought of.
The question about COVID was actually a very good one. And there is a whole study about disease and the various epidemics that have occurred through the centuries that might have taken the lives of some of your folks. So more potential research to do.
Well, and actually going along with that, the museum does have, so if you are local to the area, so if you have ancestors here in the Fremont County area, we do at our museum have a lot of death certificates. So if you think that you have an ancestor who may have died of some disease or something, you want to see those, we do have a lot of those death certificates and things like that, copies of them. So you can always contact the museum and ask about that. So. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. Like I said, if you do think of something later, you're obviously more than welcome to email the museum, and we will forward that on to Terri and get you an answer. Like I said before, we do plan to put this recording up on YouTube. So if there's something you wanted to look at again, or you wanted to share this with someone else who may not have been able to join, we will be putting that up on YouTube. That's just on YouTube at Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. And like I said, too, feel free to send us questions and we will try to get those answered for you. We will be getting the registration up for Terri's next program within the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye out for that. It'll be on the same place as always. We post it on the local newspapers, onto our Facebook. We send it out to kind of all the local places like that. So keep an eye out for that one. And we hope that everyone is excited about doing some more genealogy research. And thank you for joining us today.